Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris Welsh. I'm Director of Global and European Policy at the Freight Transport Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to our latest in a series of Brexit webinars for members. The title of today's webinar is specifically to deal with the trade on focus or focus on trade and our relationships with the EU, particularly for trade, the trade-related issues associated with our involvement in Europe going forward, and more importantly, the customs procedures related to that. FTA has been working hard on the customs elements of this. We have a specialist customs working group that has been looking at this for some time, and we've also got our FTA British Sugars Council. These are our import and export members who are also reviewing that work of our customs working group. So we come fresh from a recent customs working group meeting, and we'll be able to update you on the kind of things that members think that we should be pressing government on to get the best possible arrangements in place post Brexit. So I'm going to give you a bit about the structure of the webinar today. We're going to bring you up to speed with the context for all of this, the legal process associated with this, the sequencing of negotiations, and some of that was clearly made clear on Monday with David Davis when he met Monsieur Barnier for the first of to start the whole process of the negotiations. We're going to look at the trade and customs options as we see it. And in that regard, we, as FTA, have asked the government to review its decision to come out of the customs union in light of the uncertainty, I think, caused by the general election, where clearly the government were looking for a very large majority to take its view of how Brexit should be conducted. And I think that clearly that has been questioned to some extent by the outcome of the election. So we're just asking government to really think through the implications of leaving the customs union, not the single market. We understand that that's a clear political red line as a result of the Brexit referendum, but on customs we think that there are clear benefits to the UK from at least adhering to the customs union code to the mutual benefit of our partners in Europe and UK industry. More about that later. And then we're going to look at the various elements to consider, and this is how you as industry and our members can start to prepare for Brexit, because at least some things are becoming clearer in terms of the steps that companies can take to manage the process going forward. And then we're leaving 20 minutes at the end for a Q&A customs questions and answer session. I'll talk a bit about how we're going to conduct that in a minute. Just to tell you some house rules, how we're managing the webinar. We would ask all those that have joined the webinar to keep their telephone muted on their laptops. That will make for easier understanding for everybody else and less interference with the process. We are recording this webinar, as with all our webinars, and the recording will be made available on the FTA website. So, if there's anything that you haven't been able to raise during the course of the webinar, or something that occurs to you afterwards, you can come back, look at it, and get in touch with us if you need to. We we won't be able to deal with these kind of issues during the course of the webinar, particularly the more technical related issues. So please register those with us, and we can come back to you later. But if you've got a question for the question and answer session at the end, where we will group all the questions together and try to respond to those within the 20-minute Q&A session. The way you do that is use the chat box function on the webinar for your questions throughout the webinar as they occur to you. As I say, we'll try to round those up and deal with those at the end. If not, as I said, if we can't deal with those, then we'll during the webinar we'll get back to you on that. So that's the format for the webinar itself. Well, I think for many of you, hopefully, that have been following what FTA has been doing, it's been pretty clear that FTA has been leading on Brexit for the freight and logistics industry, and we're doing that through a whole series of Brexit working groups, interaction with the various departments, whether it's the Brexit Department itself, Department for International Trade, Department for Transport, Treasury and Customs. There's a multiplicity of forums where we are bringing FTA members' views to the attention of government and helping shape the future of Brexit environment. It's clear to us from the very outset that the decision to leave the EU will affect all segments of FTA membership, whether you are a goods vehicle operator, own account operator, hire and reward operator involved in our, for example, in our international group of membership, or members of the British Ships Council who are major importers, exporters. Every area of our membership will be affected in one way or another by the decision to leave the EU. Some opportunities, some challenges, and we'll cover those during the course of the webinar. We've done a number of things to bring to wider attention the issues that are affected by Brexit, and in fact it's quite mind-boggling. We have produced an ABC guide to Brexit, which literally does cover about 20 different areas, ranging from the implications for our trade with the Republic of Ireland, the border issues there, right the way through to how customs arrangements will be affected, what future free trade agreements look like with members, and so on and so forth. So we have a range of FTA groups, committees, councils that are responsibility for policy development in FTA. So all of the views that we take on Brexit are shaped and framed and agreed by members. And, for example, more relevance to the discussions that we're having today on trade and customs, many of those views are shaped by the FTA Customs Working Group that we've established, and FTA's National Council and the various modal councils that make that National Council format up. So all of those documents and information about events and other communications, the ABC, the manifesto, are on the FTA website. The FTA Brexit Manifesto has been developed as a major communications document with MPs and other influencers and decision makers in and around government. It covers three main areas, what we call Global Britain. This is looking outward in terms of the kind of free trade agreements that ultimately we would want, in other words, taking opportunities to expand Britain's trade beyond the EU. A major focus of government, and one of the reasons the UK government has given for exiting the EU. And that includes some practical things like the need to expand our infrastructure capacity to enable us to do that. So one of the things on top of our agenda is expand Heathrow Airport. And we are working building networks of our FTA trade association counterparts and partners around the world, where again there's a big appetite from many of those countries and economies to develop a new working relationship with Britain as a result of the opportunities that may be presented. Access to the EU market is clearly one of our most important areas, and we cover a lot of this in the webinar this morning. But this is essentially, the new deal that we want with Europe. How do we keep borders free? How do we create this frictionless new customs and trade arrangement? How do we avoid the cliff edge referred to this morning by the Chancellor? That was a piece of encouraging news on today's programme about smooth transitioning to a future trading relationship post-Brexit and avoiding the cliff edge that so many of our members are concerned about. And of course making the most of Brexit domestically when the repeal bill comes into effect. There will be clear choices that we as the UK can take in terms of the various regulations and direct EU directives that we have transposed into national legislation. So that's the broad background for today. I'm now going to hand you over to Pauline Bastidon, from our Brussels office, who is going to take you through the Article 50 process. Good morning, Pauline, and over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning to all. So the negotiations have already started and the Brexit process has already started. Technically it started when the Prime Minister triggered Article 50 with the letter on the 29th of March 2017. About a month later, the European Council agreed guidelines on how the negotiations would be conducted and proposed a sequencing which was adopted this week, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But what that means is that as of the 29th of March 2017, there's basically a 2-year period to negotiate the withdrawal agreement. The detailed future relationship is probably not going to be decided or agreed at this stage. On the 30th of March 2019, so 2 years later, in principle, come what may, the UK will exit the EU. If a deal is reached, then the UK lives and the new arrangements would apply, obviously with possible transition periods. Free trade agreement would, however, be concluded post-Brexit. If no deal is reached, then the negotiations can be extended, but of course that requires unanimous approval from all the other 27 member states in the EU. So it's not necessarily at this stage a very likely option. If no deal is reached, no extension is secured, and there's no transition in place, then immediately on the 30th of March 2019, EU treaties cease to apply, and WTO rules apply, of course, until the UK has negotiated something else, such as a free trade agreement. So I was talking a minute ago about the sequencing of negotiations. It's now absolutely crystal clear because obviously there was the first meeting that kicked off the negotiations on Monday, and at the end of that meeting, David Davis and Michel Barnier, who is the EU chief negotiator, gave a press conference to explain how the negotiations would be conducted. So they are basically going to take place in 4 successive phases. The first one, and I've circled it because that's where we are at the moment, it formally started on Monday. It's going to cover what the EU feels are the most pressing matters for an orderly withdrawal. And the UK has agreed to conduct the negotiations in this way. So basically, this first phase will focus on the financial settlement for the UK, the situation of the EU citizens in the UK, and of course UK citizens in the EU, the specific situation of Ireland, and other withdrawal arrangements, such as, for instance, what happens to international agreements that the UK has already signed up to while being a member of the EU, such as the Paris Agreement on climate change. So various working groups have been already established on these issues, on the situation of citizens, on the financial settlement, with officials from both sides, with the exception, obviously, of Ireland, because Ireland is going to be dealt with at a more senior level. It felt to be such an important issue that there is a specific group for Ireland, and that will be led from the UK side by Oliver Robbins, who's the DXEU Permanent Secretary, and from the EU side by Sabine Weyand, who's the Deputy Chief Negotiator for the EU, and basically second in command to Mr. Barnier at EU level. For Ireland, the overarching objectives of the negotiators will be twofold: to preserve the peace and basically the Good Friday Agreement, and making sure that the common travel area is protected. So as Mr. Barnier put it on Monday, the goal will basically be to allow goods to circulate in line with EU rules with third countries, which in general means involving in principle custom checks and other types of checks at the border, but without creating a visibly hard border on the island of Ireland. So this is likely to take a lot longer than the rest of the first phase. And while the first topics, we're hoping that they will be dealt with by, let's say, November, hopefully, of this year, Ireland is likely to continue focusing the discussions for a lot longer and possibly until the end of the negotiating period. The second phase is the scoping exercise for the framework for the UK and EU future relationship. It will only start if the EU27 side considers that sufficient progress has been reached with the withdrawal arrangements. So it's not up to the UK, it's up to the EU side, and that has been accepted by the UK. So in principle, our understanding is that this is unlikely to start before November, but that's really at the earliest. It could start a little bit later, unfortunately. The EU will only engage in preliminary and preparatory discussions on a framework for the future relationship at this stage, what they call the scoping exercise. So do not expect a trade agreement to be concluded while the UK is still a member of the EU, because that will not happen. We've already made that very clear. All these principles, as I said, were made clear by Mr. Barnier on Monday, and David Davis did not contradict him. Then, as part of this phase, there will also be discussion about the transitional measures, but the EU feels that this can only come once they've got some clarity as to where the relationship is going. So transition period could be foreseen once the main lines of the new framework have been defined. It would only be feasible if foreseen by the withdrawal agreement. So no deal at the point of exit means no transition, essentially. And that's also something that the EU side has made very, very clear. One option could be to try and retain existing rules and processes until a new deal has been agreed. But how you can do that in practice is not fully clear at this stage. It would imply accepting the existing EU rules for a period of time, including ECJ rulings, including freedom of movement rules. One possibly practical way of doing this is for the UK to temporarily join the EEA, like Norway, while trying to maintain the status quo on the customs side. But obviously this would come with its own challenges, from political acceptance to technical feasibility, because such arrangements need to be anticipated and there's not much time. Post-Brexit, there's a fourth phase, which is the comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU. The EU will then negotiate a very comprehensive free trade agreement expected to cover a substantial part of the UK-EU trade in goods and services. The main features of the agreement would have been defined pre-Brexit, but the agreement itself will only be concluded once the UK has formally exited the EU. And it could well require the approval of national parliaments, so it might take a little while to be negotiated and adopted. So who are the key players on the EU side? Obviously, all the main three institutions, the Council, the Commission, and the European Parliament, are heavily involved in this process. The European Council, and here you can see the picture of Donald Tusk on the left, who's the President of the European Council, is there to set the guidelines for the negotiations, which it has. It has already delegated the detail of the negotiations to the European Commission, meaning that the Council is not going to be involved in the day-to-day discussions directly, but of course they will want to get very regular updates from Michel Barnier, and they will obviously keep control of the process. And the Council will also conclude the agreement with the UK with qualified majority before exit, provided of course there is an agreement. The European Commission, and especially the task force, which is led by Michel Barnier, the chief EU negotiator, is going to lead the negotiations with the UK. So Michel Barnier is deputy, as well as the wider team of Task Force 50 will be involved in the working groups and in the discussions. Michel Barnier only at more senior level with Dave Davis. But the services of the Commission, so DG Move, for instance, DG Trade and others, are going to keep providing technical expertise throughout the process, reporting to the task force. And obviously, post-Brexit, the services would lead on the trade negotiations. In principle, not Mr. Barnier. The European Parliament should not be neglected. It will need to provide its consent before the Council can conclude the agreement with the UK. The European Parliament has appointed Guy Verhofstadt, who's a Belgian MEP, as its kind of leader, if you want, on Brexit. But there's an informal steering committee that will support him and lead on Brexit, with all committees, including the Transport Committee, including the Trade Committee, involved as well and contributing. From the UK side, well, obviously there are lots of different departments that will be involved, but DXEU, this new department for exiting the European Union, is going to be in charge of the negotiations, defining the general UK Brexit strategy, which they did with the white paper. So basically, DXEU covers all sectors and issues, from transport to trade, customs, immigration, pretty much everything that has to do with Brexit. David Davis, of course, is the Secretary of State and will lead in negotiations with Mr. Barnier and his task force. The Department for International Trade, with Liam Fox, is going to be responsible for the UK's trade strategy, as well as negotiating trade deals with third countries in the future. They will have a responsibility, of course, for the relationship with WTO, as well as trade with developing countries. And then from a trade and customs perspective, obviously the Treasury and HMRC will be heavily involved in defining new customs arrangements and the practicalities of this, new VAT rules, checks at the border, in coordination, of course, with Border Force for customs matters and other related matters. And they will be responsible also, as they are today, for the AO status and similar arrangements. Obviously, other departments in the UK will have an important role too. For instance, DFT, well, the Department for Transport, is going to be responsible for transport agreements, such as arrangements regulating access to the road market, which could, for instance, include permits in the future, if a deal providing seamless access to the EU transport market and vice versa is not concluded. So these are the key people. So now what are the trade's options? So this table sort of confronts the various options for the future relationship with the EU against the UK's objectives, which were stated in the white paper and have been reiterated since. So obviously control over labour mobility, need to have an independent trade policy, and this was reiterated yesterday in the Queen's speech and the accompanying document, with government announcing that there would be a trades bill that would be produced soon. Control over budget. Obviously the UK does not want to contribute anymore to the EU budget post-Brexit. Not being subject to CJ ruling, while obviously keeping maximum access to the single market in goods as well as in services. So you can see, based on these various options, in fact, the options that seem to be the most realistic at this point are the two at the bottom. The first one is the full customs union with the EU, which is the status quo, but that clashes with the need for an independent trade policy that the government feels is important. Partial customs union, following, for instance, the Turkish model, a little bit better, but still in terms of independent trade policy, all the UK's goals might not be fulfilled there because of the external tariffs and the fact that Turkey, for instance, cannot really have agreements with countries that the EU does not have an agreement with already. The EEA model is the so-called Norwegian model. Obviously, one of the red lines for the UK government being the control of labour mobility and immigration. That could be a problem because EEA is similar to EU membership in that respect. You have freedom of movement as well. So the two lines at the bottom seem to be based on the UK's objectives, the most realistic at this stage. They might not necessarily be the preferred options, but they are the most likely for now. A free trade agreement, which obviously would be the best option, or the most favoured nation system under WTO, where basically you kind of tick all the boxes in terms of UK's objectives, but it's not the best in terms of access to single market in goods or in services, indeed. So a little bit more about the UK government's position in terms of access to the single market. This has been made clear again on Monday by David Davis. The UK will not remain member of the single market or the customs union. It was also made clear yesterday in the Queen's speech. The UK will aim to negotiate a free trade deal and a customs agreement with the EU. That was also stated, although the features will need to be defined later. But the focus is very much on an independent trade policy. This idea of global Britain, allowing the UK to contract trade deals with a variety of countries with which the EU might not have a deal at this point. So the government announced yesterday that there would be both a trade bill and a customs bill that would come out. And obviously the idea is to take back control of trade policy and have a standalone customs regime. So unfortunately the option of staying in the customs union seems slightly less realistic now based on this. No hard border with Ireland in Ireland is obviously a priority also for the UK government. In terms of the EU views, so obviously they've said for a long time no cherry picking, so that means that the four freedoms, as they call them, come as a package. So for instance, freedom of movement is absolutely mandatory if we want to go for an option like EEA, which is the Norwegian model, which of course would be the EU's preferred option at this stage because it's the closest to the status quo. They have already said that there wouldn't be sectoral deals covering only certain types of goods. That's to be excluded, and it's dubious whether that would in any way be compatible with WTO rules. Ireland is seen as a priority for the EU side. They're very well aware of the sensitivities, and obviously the Irish government has got quite a strong voice there. So they want to protect the Good Friday Agreement, common travel area, and see no visible border in Ireland. They made it very clear that transition would need to be part of a withdrawal agreement if we want that to happen, although they would also favour a transitional period. And as far as the trade deal is concerned, the red line is that this would only be negotiated with Brexit. So what are the likely outcomes based on this? Well, the best option, based on that little table I presented and what we know of the respective positions of the UK and the EU side, is a free trade agreement, not a model like Norway, for instance. But what is at stake? Well, what's at stake is, of course, the future trade arrangements and the procedures, both for the long term and the short term during a possible transition period. Whether all sectors are going to retain maximum access to single markets, whether services, for instance, will have access to the single market as well, quite relevant for transport services, and what the degree of regulatory convergence would be. Obviously, the default option, if there is no deal, no agreement of any kind, is to trade under so-called WTO rules, which means no preferential access, and obviously it means that tariffs that are currently in place and have been registered by the EU at WTO level would apply, such as 30% for confectionery, 10% for cars, or 35% for dairy products. It would then be dubious what kind of customs procedures would be in place. There would not necessarily be much time to adapt at all. What about the phased implementation? That probably would not be an option anymore. Would the UK products still be recognized as equivalent to EU products? I mean, quite a lot of questions. We understand that work is already underway to establish the UK's own schedules covering trade in goods and services at WTO, and that government's aim is to establish our schedules in a way that replicates as far as possible the current position that the UK has as a new member state. So obviously there are preparations underway to try and minimize disruptions, but still a lot of question mark on the no deal option. So what do we want as FTA? Obviously no barriers to trade with the EU. We want to see seamless trade with minimal red tape, and as far as possible, no additional costs. We'd like to see no tariffs or quotas for trade with the EU. So I mentioned some of the tariffs registered by the EU for goods for most favored nations at the moment. It's more than 35% for dairy products. It's 6% for coffee and tea, more than 20% for sugar, for instance, or confectionery, 19% for tobacco, and more than 11% for clothing. So obviously that's significant. But the most important point that should not be forgotten are non-tariff barriers. So things like technical measures, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, labeling, conformity assessment, pre-shipment inspections, as well as non-technical measures such as the rules of origin, which is there to demonstrate that products do indeed come from where they are supposed to come, so in this case the UK, potential procurement restrictions, export taxes, and so on and so on. So all of these things could have a much more significant impact than the tariffs themselves, and that's why we're really saying that they should be taken into account and avoided as much as possible. The issue of borders is a really important issue, and this was touched upon by Chris Welsh in the introduction. At the moment, we have juxtaposed controls for immigration. So basically, the UK border is in Calais rather than being in the UK. But there have been calls for renegotiation of the UK agreements in France. And the new French president, Mr. Macron, hinted that this might be a good idea. Indeed. And if that were to be the case, obviously their intention is not to reinforce the agreement, it's rather to make sure that the frontier goes back to the UK. That would be a problem because of restricted space in the UK, meaning that service frequency could end up being limited. And obviously customs checks after Brexit could create also significant delays with a huge economic impact for the UK. But I'm now going to hand over to Alex Beach, Head of Global Policy at FTA, who's going to explain that in more details.
Thank you, Pauline. Hello, everybody. Following up from Chris's introduction and then Pauline, I'm going to now go into a little bit more depth about the customs issues around Brexit. So just to start again from the beginning, very briefly here, we know from the Brexit White Paper, February 2017, and as Pauline has explained, this has really been confirmed by the Queen's speech yesterday. The UK will not be in a customs union with the EU, but will seek a new customs agreement and, to use the government's term here, seek a frictionless trading relationship with the EU. So as Pauline said already, I won't repeat it, but this allows the UK to meet its own policy objectives around free trade outside of the EU. Now these following slides are really all about how to minimise the friction with particularly with EU trade after Brexit. So can we move on to the next slide, please? However, what I wanted to start with was a slide about the authorised economic operator scheme first, because this whole issue of AEO flows through much of what I'm about to talk about. So the AEO is essentially a trusted trader scheme. It sets up a system whereby customs authorities essentially share the liability, they share the issues, they share the paperwork, they share the load and the burden with the private sector. Now, the private sector companies that get authorised have to show a very substantial body of evidence that they can be trusted in terms of their fiscal and customs arrangements, for which there's a special AEO designation in the EU law, and also in security. So, you know, if you want to get certain security benefits, you have to have very, very tight controls around staff checks and packing and security and other issues. So it's not at the moment particularly easy to get. You do have to show a lot of background and responsibility as a company. But if you can do this, and this currently applies to trade with non-EU countries, you can get some really important benefits, which are the bullet points here. You can get faster transit through border controls. You can get what they call periodic reporting. So you submit a periodic report of your customs duties in this case, and you can defer payment of customs duties as well. The key one here is the border control, and I'll come back to that. The other thing about AEO is that it's a global scheme. It's run by the World Customs Organization as a standard. Different geographic entities have their own legal interpretations, but because it's a global scheme, it works for non-EU trade, and it could theoretically work really well for our EU trade if we can have an agreement with the EU to allow it. So if we move on then, Pauline, with that bit of background, I'm going to talk now about the implications of no customs agreement. And so what I've been trying to do is, with our members, work through the implications of essentially if the negotiation on all this breaks down, and we go to a full third country status, to use the European Union jargon, trading relationships with the EU. So let's just imagine that world, if we can, please. No facilitations, no agreement, no customs agreement, no free trade deal, nothing. As Pauline's already said, we have to comply with the European Union's trade rules, essentially. So if you are a company exporting into the EU from a non-EU country with no agreement on anything at all, you do have to comply with quite a lot of rules and paperwork, and that ranges from the standards of your product, the technical standards, the safety standards to get into the EU market, the rules of origin, where was it made, customs duties is just one piece of it. There's also any VAT applicable, any applicable quotas. So if you're importing, say, bananas into the EU, you know there is a very tightly run quota program for that. And you also have to show the evidence of compliance with all this. And, you know, and it's really important, and Pauline's already said it, what we need in the long term or the medium term is a trade deal with the EU, because only a free trade deal can knock down all of the barriers that I've just summarised. You know, we need that. But what I'm going to go on to is what can you do if you don't have a free trade deal? What can you do if you want to sort the customs out first? But just a couple more points about, if we move on there, Pauline, on to some other of the impacts. I won't talk too much about this, but, you know, if you're a non-EU country trading with the EU company, you have to complete rather a lot of paperwork. On customs alone, you have to do a declaration. This is going to be new to many companies that are not used to trading in this way. Not all companies by any means, but there will be quite a lot who are used to doing business with the continental EU who've never done this kind of customs work before. This is complicated stuff, and for the most of the non-EU trade, companies either have in-house expertise, if they're big enough, or they use a forwarder and or a specialised customs agent. What happens a lot of the time is that there's a combination of that. So you might have an import-export logistics team for a big multinational firm that deal with the transport and some of the customs stuff, but even they tend to use some specialised third parties, maybe housed within one of the big forwarders, to actually do the detailed work of the customs declarations. We're going to need to see a lot of training, recruitment, or increased use of third parties. You know, we've been working with our members to try and put a number on this, but we are talking, because we're talking about millions more declarations potentially being needed, we think we've been given a cost of between £30 and £100 per declaration to use a third party. So the maths here are quite staggering in terms of the cost of business. The second point, which you may well have seen in the press if you're following this stuff, is whether the customs IT systems can cope. There is a new customs declaration system being brought into the UK. You know, questions are being asked about whether it can cope with the potentially 350 million declarations or more that could be required if we move in this direction. Even if it can cope with it in volume terms, there is a real concern about the speed that these things could be processed. I won't say more about that, but if we can move on, there are the other more day-to-day elements to consider. Here, thank you, Pauline. So, and again, you know, Pauline's mentioned the impact of delays. I've been looking very specifically at Dover-Calais, which is one of the biggest trade routes into the EU and back to the UK. You know, look, we've got real evidence here, real-world evidence of what delays on this trade route can do. I'm sure people on the call will remember some of the strikes that took place and delays 2015 and 2016. I'm very interested in what happened in 2016, which was where it wasn't a strike, it was a shortage of staff on the French side. And, you know, we had delays of up to 10 hours, we had traffic queuing back, we had motorists stranded in their cars. You know, it's so busy with about 10,000 trucks going through a day on the Ro-Ro routes, roll-on, roll-off ferry routes, that even a small delay can have a big backup effect and create very long traffic problems and congestion up to Dover and consequent delays. And so I think one thing that we're trying to understand is what would the real economic impacts of that be? You know, and you're talking about in particular impacts on any goods and services that rely on express short-time deliveries, food, pharmaceuticals, banking documents, post, and you know, in our case, we're looking at what are called flight trucks, which are these trucks which are specifically run by airlines carrying cargo bound for Heathrow to be loaded into the belly hold of aircraft. That whole sector relies on fast passage through Dover-Calais. Yeah, thanks for moving on the slides there, Pauline. So it's a complicated picture. It needs to be done looking in detail at the sectors involved and what time delays could mean. And you know, I'm only talking here about the customs and border controls. I'm not even mentioning some of the phytosanitary checks, for example. If we don't have no free trade deal, it's perfectly possible that imports of, say, meat could be tied up in veterinary inspections as well. So I'm leaving that completely aside. Just the border and customs checks alone could create quite severe disruptions, and we're calling on the government to do a full and proper impact assessment of this, to which we are very, very happy to contribute with our members. So thanks, Pauline. If we could move on to the next slide. So having painted that rather bleak picture, we're trying to come up with some solutions here that can help speed passage through the border. So first off, I've got 3 slides about what could be done if there is no customs agreement at all. So working with our members, you know, what options can be off the shelf, if you like, and just used on day one of Brexit with no agreement needed at all. Now, one of these is the TIR Convention and the accompanying instrument known as the TIR carnet. Now, essentially, this is a scheme which those of you who've been in this game from the sort of back from the mid-90s may well remember. It used to be used quite extensively for goods coming from the EU, from the UK, transiting the EU and going to some of the East European countries like Romania that are now in the EU. So an example would be textiles taken from the UK, taken across the EU and finished in Romania and then brought back for sale in the UK. So a lot of that shipments use TIR, and what this means is you get you seal your truck, you get a TIR badge on the back of your truck, and it flows through the EU border, in our case the Calais border a lot of the time, without being unloaded and inspected at consignment level to check what's in the truck. Now, you know, it's kind of a clunky system, I think it's fair to say. There is an E version of this, but it does require an extra layer of paperwork in addition to any customs and other paperwork that the trader would need to do. Even though it can be filed electronically, there's still a requirement to have the paperwork with you so that the border agent can check that the truck matches the consignment. You know, it requires a certain amount of authorization for the trader, but that's not linked to the authorized economic operator scheme, so the trader would have to seek 2 different authorizations, and really it's just not tested at this level. With 10,000 trucks a day using TIR, you know, it's a scheme that works well for some of the eastern borders of the EU and non-EU countries there at fairly low volumes. You know, we have very big doubts as to whether this can be scaled up and used in time on Brexit Day. So I'm putting this out there as an option. We're not confident that this could be used to facilitate trade at the volumes and level required. So moving on, you know, another option that the UK could look at is creating a system whereby the consignments, the goods in the vehicle, are matched to the registration of the trailer or the tractor unit itself, such that the goods and the vehicle can be granted fast passage through the border into the UK in this case. So the idea would be, just to run through an example, goods would leave from a warehouse in, say, the south of France. Their customs declarations and security declarations would be filed electronically at the warehouse. The goods would be loaded into the vehicle leaves the warehouse. Now, while the vehicle is driving, the IT system in Britain electronically clears, approves both the security and the customs declaration. At the same time, an electronic message is sent that matches the vehicle to that consignment. And so a message is then sent that grants a green light to that vehicle to be loaded onto a ferry and arrive in France. You know, look, it's not the most technologically challenging thing in the world to do. It may well be that something like this might need to be considered. There are a number of practical challenges with this. You know, including, for example, what if the vehicle is carrying some consignments for which the customs and security declarations have been approved, and some consignments with which there is an error in the processing or they've not been approved. You know, we are struggling a bit to think of how how customs departments could be confident that these kind of consignments wouldn't need to be inspected. So this is an option. I think it's something that we may well see in some way in the future, depending on what happens politically. But again, we need to be working with the government to say, look, this is a type of thing you could be thinking about, but here are some of the practical challenges. I'll leave that there, but happy to pick up that one in the Q&A session later on. So finally, a few other ideas that we've been discussing with the members. UK could theoretically recognise companies that are authorised as AEOs by their own member state. So we could say, look, if you are a German AEO authorised trader, we could grant you the facilitations that you would expect or be entitled to have with a third country. So that could include fast passage through the border. There's quite a bit of detail within that as to how that would work, but it's an option. However, I think at this point, without some kind of negotiated agreement with the European Union, this is something that could only be applied for imports. And so, look, in conclusion for this little section, there aren't a huge amount of options out there, and we've been testing it with the members. These are some of the ones that we've thought of. But I think we're into the world now of needing to negotiate some customs agreements of some kind with the EU to keep the trade flowing. So I'm going to summarise some of the thoughts on that next. And going on, look, everything I'm going to say now requires a deal to be done. However, the good news is these are all things that can be agreed way in advance of and without any need for a comprehensive free trade agreement. They're quite limited. They deal only with the customs and trade flow at the border, but they can be relatively quick wins. So the first one, I think the most important one here, is the Common Transit Convention. This is something that's kind of new to me and a lot of other people that live and work in UK. It is a scheme that allows fast transit through the border for a lot of countries that border the EU but aren't necessarily in the EU itself. So as the slide says, it includes Turkey, which is kind of a special case because they're in a limited customs union anyway, but it includes Serbia, which is completely independent of the EU. And what this does is allows transit in and out of non-EU countries, and it allows goods to be cleared at the point of arrival, essentially. This is really a key point for the UK to be thinking about how can we become a member of this convention. I think technically it requires another member to actually invite us to do so, but this has got to be on the table for the future. So yeah, next one please. Some other options here. I've talked about AEOs throughout this. We would encourage the government to push for a mutual recognition agreement with the EU for AEOs. This is something the EU does quite a lot. There's one of these MRAs in place with China and the United States. There's no free trade deal with China and the United States, but they do have an agreement to recognise each other's AEO companies. So this could be something, again, that's a relatively quick win. We've been talking a lot to our members and thinking a lot about juxtaposed customs controls in the way that you have, as Pauline said, juxtaposed immigration controls. There's a lot of challenges here, including, I think from a UK perspective, it would be helpful to have goods cleared at the border in Calais. We would have a lot of challenges, however, I think, implementing a reciprocal arrangement in Dover, where space is very limited. Our preference would be schemes that allow for pre-clearance for goods to be cleared electronically before they even leave the warehouse, to avoid, as far as possible, customs being cleared at the border, recognising there will always be traders who turn up with their paperwork from time to time. Another option is setting up some kind of AEO type scheme, maybe not a full AEO scheme, but a trusted trader type of scheme. I think this is something worth exploring. However, I think, again, AEO is such a well-known entity all around the world that it would be better to make the AEO system and application process and management much more seamless and effective in Britain, to try to get as many companies as possible signed up as AEOs. because I think, that will be easier to agree with the EU, and it gives you quite a lot of benefits if you're trading outside trading outside the EU. So something to be looked at, but we have some reservations about that as well. And another option, how likely this is a better question for Pauline, but a transition deal. So could we have, let's say, 5 years where for a transition period only, we have full trading relationships as we would get as a full member of the EU. So in the single market, in the customs union, for a transition period only, while we come through with some of these agreements that I've mentioned in this presentation. So moving on, some things that would help from the domestic side to make this work. Greater use of self-assessment. As I said before, clearing as much goods as possible at the warehouse, at the site, before they even depart is going to be a huge help. Taking this away from the border, rethinking the border as a geographic entity and thinking about it a little bit more differently. Second one, maintaining low-value consignment relief. Now that is a very wordy and policy wonky way of saying it's the de minimis level. It's where you do not have to declare low-value goods to customs. This is quite a controversial topic. There is some misdeclaration of goods that goes on with this, but we want to see this maintained at least on a transitionary basis. We're very, very worried that if you suddenly on Brexit Day take away this relief for low-value goods, it could double or more the number of declarations that need to be done. This is something also the Royal Mail are very worried about as well. It could theoretically apply to anything sent by the post, so in and out of the EU once we leave. So it's a really, really big issue, and we'll be working hard with the government on that one. And finally, simplifying customs procedures, things that we can do in Britain that still enable us to trade seamlessly and use the customs IT systems of other of EU member states, but allow some simplification at our end. A couple of other things. It's really important with everything I said that the UK gets a much better grasp on the importance of AEO and helps businesses to get authorised, to work with them, to help them understand the requirements, and to try and get more companies involved in AEO. As the slide shows, there are over 6,000 AEO registered companies in Germany, about 1,500 in Netherlands and France. Both the Dutch and the French have got about 3 times as many AEO registered companies as we have. There are good reasons for that. AEO is for non-EU trade. So if you're a company that doesn't do any trade with the EU, you're not going to have AEO. You're not even allowed to actually, under the current rules of the government, actually even apply for it. They will reject your application straight away if you only trade with the EU. So what we want to see is the Customs Department allowing a kind of build-up of applications. So working with companies that, yes, maybe they're currently only EU, but helping them understand the requirements, get their application ready to submit. So on Brexit Day, they can be processed very, very quickly because there's already a trusted relationship in place. And I guess the final point on this is that the UK government set up in a well-meaning way all manner of committees and groups and working groups across DXEU, across the Revenue and Customs, with Treasury, with the Department for International Trade, with the Department for Transport. We want to see that done in a much more joined up way. There's a WTO agreement called the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which the UK is a signatory to. That calls for a Trade Facilitation Committee. And this could be a perfect way to bring all these disparate streams of activity together to get the trade and the government talking to each other in a strategic way and solving some of these problems. So last couple of things from me. There's a slide here. I'm not going to run through this again, but this summarises everything I've just said about the various options available, ranging from those that can be done with no agreement, those that can be done with an agreement, potentially quick wins, and I think that just moving on to and this is going to be available, as Pauline said, this whole thing's being recorded. You can look this up at any time for the summary. And if we just move on to my conclusion slide, thank you. look, there are no realistic options available to reduce delays without some kind of customs agreement. You know, I've been through the things that you can do. I've tested it with the members. You know, there are things that can be done, but they all have issues or require a huge amount of development and IT support. It's not impossible, but is it realistic? This is where we have a big, big question mark. You know, our number one thing here is to say, look, with this in mind and the delays and the economic impacts, can we please rethink the view about the customs union? I think, having seen the Queen's speech yesterday, to be realistic about it, we might be adjusting our view to say, look, let's have a 5-year transition period where the customs union and requirements remain. You know, even that may be unpalatable to the UK government, but it's really important that we as FTA stress that point because of the lack of other options if we really do walk away with no kind of customs deal at all. However, you know, look more positively, trying to work with where we are realistically, there are, as we've shown, some very good, relatively quick wins that can be introduced if there's goodwill on each side. You know, the number one thing for me is the Common Transit Convention and the recognition of AEOs. If we can just get even those two things done, that's a start. And then in the medium and long term, to go right back to the beginning, to knock all these barriers down properly, we need a comprehensive free trade agreement which will deal with customs, which will deal with phytosanitary checks, which will deal with rules of origin. May not get us to the completely frictionless trade, which is our vision, but it will. That is the way to really knock some of these down and get us back to a relatively frictionless trading relationship with the EU in the longer term. So thank you. I'll hand back to Chris at this point. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. And now, just summarising some of the practical implications of Brexit and the more detailed reports you've had from Alex Veach and Pauline Bastion. I just want to stress that, you know, pre-Brexit, we're still in the European Union, so nothing changes. No. In that respect, we continue trading with the EU as before. So all EU rules and regulations apply, and just to reiterate, the government has transposed all of the EU legislation into UK national legislation through the Great Repeal Bill. Over time, that is likely to change post-Brexit, but all the working time directive arrangements, all the other social chapter provisions, all the rules related to transport and logistics remain firmly in place. Of course, the decision to leave the EU has caused and is causing a lot of business uncertainty, major problems people perceive through the limitations of rights for EU nationals to work in the UK and the reciprocal arrangements in EU countries, concern about access to sources of labour and skills in certain areas, not least those labour and skill needs in the freight and logistics industry. And of course we've seen a sharp depreciation in the value of the pound versus the euro and other major currencies, which of course is a potential big advantage for UK exporters, tempered by the fact that many UK exports have a high degree of components or which are imported, which are used in our manufacturing goods. So some of those advantages are weakened there, and certainly the depreciation in sterling against the pound has had a big impact on Irish trade. But post Brexit, well, it's all to do with what deal is eventually done with between Britain and the EU. I think Monday's initial start to those negotiations got off to a good start. There's an agreement on the process and the priorities for taking those forward. The key focus will be on this low friction trade procedures, which FTA is taking a priority, and it is in the white paper. The government is committed to that, and I think the job of FTA is to ensure that we bring forward the kind of arrangements that are going to be necessary to ensure that borders flow as before without interruption, that we come forward with some positive proposals for the government to show how we can make the customs procedures work. And Alex has given you some indication of those things that, in discussion with members, we are reaching agreement on. And in that regard, over the next 2 weeks, following that extensive consultation with members in our customs working group and our interaction with the various government departments and other trade bodies and other trade associations, we are coming close to framing the kind of conditions that we would be looking for government to take on board in terms of ensuring that that frictionless ambition that the government has got is translated into reality on the ground. So that's the formal part of the presentation of where we are with trade and customs, the analysis of where we are, some of the potential problems, some of the choices and options that we've got. I'm hoping that that is beginning to help members understand some of the things that they can do at the moment, and we will sort of move on to that discussion right now. So there are a number of questions for industry to consider, and I think this is the opportunity that members joining the webinar have got to place any questions you have, any points you want to raise in discussion, and collectively between us, Pauline, Alex and myself, we will endeavour to answer those questions. If there aren't any immediate questions, then and that there are points that occur to you subsequent to this presentation, as I say, please do get back in touch with us. There's the opportunity to post your questions after this webinar has concluded. So, I think that some of those questions for industry are: where do we see the biggest pressure points? And our assessment quite clearly is that at the borders, so we need procedures at the borders to solve those particular problems. We want to avoid disruption and delays in the supply chain for the type of commodities that Alex referred to that are very dependent on the Calais-Dover route for the UK supply chain. I think that the advice that we are starting to give to members based upon discussions with members in the working groups that we have is that now is the time to really start to discuss with your trading partners, particularly those in continental Europe, the kind of challenges that they're going to face you, and start to put into place some of the procedures, at least to enable you to manage the post-Brexit arrangements in the best possible way. So I think we're starting to see the opportunity now for certain measures that companies can put in place to prepare for that. And all the time we're learning about the best practices and ideas that are coming forward through the members and so on. So what can you do? We move over to the next slide. Yeah, I mean, it's the internal arrangements that companies would want to make here. There's going to be different departments involved. There's clearly the freight and logistics teams. There's your treasury department that may deal with VAT, customs, those kind of arrangements, and so on. That all of those departments are going to be affected in slightly different ways. But in terms of ensuring that the overall supply chain and the facility to trade and meet your customer requirements, we certainly do recommend the setting up of internal groups or task forces within the company to look at how you're going to prepare and identify actions that you need to undertake. I've covered some of those off already. There's representatives from operations, customs, logistics, supply chain management, your PR communications company, your treasury, those kind of organisations. Again, working with suppliers and partners to conduct, your own SWOT analysis, in terms of your import-export business, the people implications of that. As Alex has indicated that we may need 350 million additional customs declarations for EU trade, where a lot of people are not familiar with the customs procedures. Sometimes very separate people deal with the EU arrangements compared to our external trade arrangements. So it may well be that people have got to be brought up to speed with customs procedures, go through training, even looking at the people's implication. Do staff need to be reallocated to dealing with different tasks? Do you need to recruit people into this area? Are you going to start exploring the opportunities of working with specialist freight forwarders in customs to give you advice in that area? So I'm not getting any immediate sort of questions coming up on the screen from members. So this is, as I say, this is your opportunity to place those questions right now. Okay, since we're not getting any questions coming up, I'm taking it that people who've understood where we are as FTA on the process and how you can engage with FTA and keep informed about these developments. In addition to what you can do, this is my last slide on this shows you can follow us on these monthly webinars, which are being well attended. So we're confident the members are getting all the information and up-to-date information that they need to make the kind of decisions I referred to earlier. Keep in touch with what we're doing at FTA on our website and the other communication channels, the FTA e-news briefings and so on. If you want to get more actively engaged in this work, and certainly that is what we are finding, we're seeing new personalities, new individuals that are joining us in our various working groups that we haven't seen before, member companies, different people. So you can get involved in our customs working group and various other forums. You can join a regional freight council to get involved in our national council arrangements. You can get involved with the British Sugars Council, the FTA Rail Freight Council, whichever your main focus on freight logistics and how you move your goods you can be involved in that process. So please take that opportunity if you feel that it's going to help you manage your concerns. And we want to hear from you. As Alex pointed out before, we've been working very, very closely with members on framing our own response to government in this area, testing what works well and what doesn't work well, and help shaping our policies. And I can't tell you enough how the practical knowledge and understanding of how the supply chain works, how the customs procedures work, really does make a big impact in terms of assessing ideas that are flowing out from government, and for us to put really sensible, doable, workable proposals to government about how we move forward in the future. So we're keen to find out what works practically for you, and to find solutions for how we deal with the issues that you face. So I now, on the basis that there are no questions, I'm going to conclude today's webinar. So I'd like to thank Alex Beach, who's our head of global and European policy, for his contributions on the customs and trade angle to that, and Pauline Bastidon, who's head of European policy and heads up our Brussels office, and very close to what is happening from the Brussels side of Brexit, and from myself, Chris Welsh, Director of Global and European Policy. But also a big thank you to you as members for taking the trouble to be engaged in this webinar, which I hope you have found useful. Our next webinar is on the 13th of July, and you'll find details of that on our FTA Brexit website, so fta.co.uk/Brexit, and you can also ensure that you keep well up to speed through our various information and updates that we place on the website. So without further ado, thank you very much for your attention, and have a good day. Goodbye.